Welcome to the Walking Dread podcast. I'm Adrian.
And I'm Julia. Get ready for a daily dose of addictive horror stories and nightmares and terrifying tales.
Right.
Ancient curses, all delivered with masterful storytelling. It'll shake you to your core.
Yeah, we're going to keep it spooky and fun. So if you're looking for a little chill down your spine, hit that rate and follow button.
Yes. Today we've got a story. It really digs into this whole idea of consequences. It's called life debt.
Life debt. Just the title. It sounds ominous. What's it about?
Imagine this. You cheat death. You're in this horrific accident. Everyone's amazed by your survival. You're thinking you got lucky, right? But then you realize surviving came with a terrifying price.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I'm hooked. Tell me more.
Our main character, John, he's in this terrible car crash. It really should have killed him. But somehow, he walks away with barely a scratch. Doctors are baffled.
Sounds pretty lucky, right?
You'd think. But there's something different about John now. Something's attached to him. A shadow. And not just any shadow, okay? It's described as this, deeper darkness, and get this, it moves on its own.
Wait, hold on. His shadow moves independently. Okay, that's not just creepy. That's straight up unsettling. What does that even mean for John?
Well, at first it's subtle. Bad things just start happening to people around him. Freak accidents, really bad luck, And each time John notices his shadow acting strangely just before, like with the first incident, a waitress is walking by, slips, and the ceramic mug she's carrying shatters against her temple.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it's not like the shadow itself is attacking people, but it's connected to these awful events. So John's basically a walking bad omen.
Precisely. And can you imagine the guilt, the horror he must feel knowing he's somehow linked to these tragedies? He tries to warn people, especially those whose shadows seem to, mirror his own. But nobody believes him. They just brush it off.
Of course they wouldn't believe him. Who would? Hey, my shadow says you're about to die. Yeah, it sounds crazy. But the thing is, he's right. And knowing he's powerless to stop it, knowing people are dying because of this thing attached to him, that's got to be an incredible burden.
Exactly. It eats away at him until he can't take it anymore, He decides to isolate himself. He's hoping to protect others from his presence. Ends up in a cabin in the woods. He's thinking that maybe if he's away from people, the shadow can't hurt anyone.
So he's literally trying to outrun his fate, hiding from the consequences of his survival. That's a powerful image. A man alone in the woods, haunted by his own shadow. But we know from the title that there's a debt to be paid. Makes you wonder what's going to happen in those woods.
Well, that's where the story takes a really terrifying turn. The woods, they're already a place of shadows and secrets, But with John there, they become even more oppressive. Remember how his shadow was described? That deeper darkness? It gets worse. The shadows in the woods, they seem to twist unnaturally, as if responding to his presence.
Whoa, so the setting itself is becoming more sinister because of him. The woods are reflecting his inner turmoil. That's such a classic horror trope, but the author's really using it effectively here. You can practically feel the dread building. So what happens next?
John sees a figure in the woods, a skeletal woman. Her eyes, they're empty sockets, echoing his own, encroaching despair.
Okay, I've got chills already. A skeletal woman appearing in the woods to a guy whose shadow is connected to death. That's seriously creepy. What does she do? Does she attack him?
That's what's interesting. She doesn't attack him directly. She reaches out not to John himself, but to this monstrous shadow that's writhing at his feet. It's described as a transaction, an offer he can't refuse.
Whoa. An offer he can't refuse from a skeletal figure in the woods. This is heavy stuff. It sounds like John's about to make a deal with death itself. But what kind of deal could this be? What does John have to offer?
That's what we're about to find out. But one thing's clear. John's isolation in the woods, his desperate attempt to escape his fate, it's led him right to the heart of darkness.
And whatever this transaction entails, it can't be good.
You're right. It feels like things are about to get even darker for John. And for us listeners, this is a great place to leave things for now. We've got this incredible setup, a man haunted by his shadow, a skeletal figure offering a terrifying deal. Can't wait to see what happens next. But we'll have to wait for part 2 to unpack the consequences of John's life debt. Welcome back to the Walking Dread podcast. We left off with John, our shadow-haunted protagonist. He's about to make a deal with this skeletal figure out in the woods.
Right. And this transaction, as the author calls it, this is where things really start to shift. It's not just about the plot, the themes of the story, they start to come into focus.
One thing that really struck me about this part is how the author uses the setting to just build that suspense. Those twisted shadows, that skeletal figure, they all create this like oppressive atmosphere that really amps up the fear factor. Absolutely. It's like the woods themselves are reflecting John's internal state. He's trying to escape the consequences of his survival, but he's just sinking deeper into this darkness.
Yeah, and that's where this transaction comes in. I'm dying to know, what kind of deal does John make with this skeletal figure? What does he have to give up? What price does he have to pay to further cheat death?
Well, it's not so much about him giving something up. It's more about him accepting his fate, you see. After that transaction, his shadow changes. It becomes even more powerful, more sentient. It no longer just foreshadows death. It's like it's seeking it out.
So it's not passively mirroring him anymore. It's actively involved in these deaths. That's a chilling thought. He goes from being a harbinger of death to, like, an active participant.
In a way, yeah. He's no longer just a witness. He's a messenger. His shadow stretches out ahead of him like it's searching for its next victim. And the people around him, they react to his presence instinctively.
Remember that line from the story? They knew. We all know deep down when the clock is ticking too loudly. It gives me chills just thinking about it. What do you make of that?
That line, it really gets to the heart of what makes the story so terrifying, right? It's not just about the supernatural elements. It's about that primal fear of death that we all share. And John, with his monstrous shadow, he becomes a physical embodiment of that fear.
You know, it's interesting. The story never really explains how John cheated death in the first place. We're just kind of thrown into the aftermath, the consequences of his survival. Do you think that was intentional on the author's part?
I think so. By leaving those circumstances of his survival ambiguous, the author makes the story more universal. It's not about this specific event. It's about this broader idea that there are consequences to every action. Even something, as seemingly positive as surviving a fatal accident.
Right. It makes you wonder what seemingly insignificant choices we make every day, they could lead to these unforeseen consequences. It's like the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
One flap of a wing can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. John choosing to live, it sets off this terrifying chain reaction that he's ultimately powerless to stop.
Exactly, and that ties into this whole theme of fate versus free will, right? John tries to fight his destiny, to isolate himself, protect others, but in the end, he's forced to accept that he's just a pawn in this larger game. He's a slave to death, a mere tool in the hands of fate.
That's such a bleak outlook, but it's hard to argue with given what happens in the story. John's life, it's no longer his own. He's trapped in this cycle of death, this perpetual messenger of the end. And the people around him, even if they don't understand why, they can sense it. They feel that chill, that creeping dread, like they know their time is up.
And that's what makes the story so effective, right? It doesn't offer any easy answers or these comforting platitudes. It just presents this raw, unsettling reality. Death is coming for us all, and sometimes we get a glimpse of its approach.
It really makes you think about the fragility of life and the inevitability of death, doesn't it? And it reminds us that even though we might try to outrun our fate, we can't escape it forever.
Absolutely. But life, death, it isn't just a story about death. It's also about the choices we make while we're alive. John's story, it's a warning, but it's also a call to action. It reminds us to cherish every moment, make the most of the time we have, because, well, you never know when our clock is going to stop ticking.
You've hit on something really profound there. It'd be easy to walk away from the story feeling despairing. But I think there's also a message of hope, a reminder that we have the power to choose how we live our lives, even in the face of death.
I agree. It makes you think, if you were in John's shoes, how would you handle this terrible knowledge? Would you try to warn people, knowing they might not believe you? Would you embrace your role as this messenger of death? Or would you try to fight it? Try to find some way to break free from this terrifying fate?
Those are some heavy questions to ponder. And you know what? I think that's a great place to leave things for now. We've unpacked the symbolism, we explored the themes of fate and free will, even touched on the psychological impact of John's experience. But we still need to talk about the reactions of the people around him. How do they cope with knowing that death is near? We'll delve into that and more when we return for part 3 of our discussion on life debt.
Welcome back to the Walking Dread podcast. We've been talking about this chilling story, life debt, John's transformation into this walking omen of death.
It really gets under your skin, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We talked about his guilt, the isolation, and the terrifying power of his shadow. But what about the people around him? How do they react to John? They sense his connection to death on this primal level.
Yeah, they know without knowing how they know.
Exactly. Remember that line for the story. They knew. We all know deep down when the clock is ticking too loudly. It's subtle, but it's so effective.
Yeah.
The author doesn't need to spell it out for us.
We get it. There's something about John that just, like, screams death is near.
It's like they can smell it on him, you know?
Yeah.
And that brings up a really interesting question. What does that say about our own relationship with death? Do we all have this innate sense of when our time is up?
That's a question that's haunted humanity for centuries. This story, it takes it out of the realm of philosophy and just throws it right in our faces. These people, they feel a chill when John's around. They get this sense of unease. They might not be able to articulate it, but they know something's wrong.
It's like John becomes this living embodiment of our own mortality. And I think that's what makes life debt so terrifying. It's not just a ghost story. It's a story about the inevitability of death and how we as humans, we grapple with that knowledge.
And the story, it doesn't offer any easy answers or these comforting solutions. It just presents this stark reality. Death is a part of life. It's coming for us all. And sometimes we get a glimpse of its approach, whether it's through a shadow, a premonition, just a gut feeling.
Which brings us back to John. Knowing that he carries this weight, this terrible knowledge, does he ever try to warn people? Or does he just resign himself to his role as this messenger of death?
That's the tragedy of John's situation. He tries to warn people, but they don't believe him.
Right.
They think he's crazy or just messing with them.
Yeah.
And who can blame them, really? I mean, it's not exactly easy to accept that this guy's shadow is like a harbinger of your doom.
So he's trapped. He can't escape his fate. And he can't warn others without sounding insane. It's like he's caught in this terrible loop, forced to watch as people around him meet their end.
Exactly. And that isolation, that inability to connect with others, it just adds another layer of horror to this story, right? John is burdened with this terrible knowledge, but he has no one to share it with. He's utterly alone.
And that brings us back to the core themes of the story: consequences, fate, and the price of survival. John cheated death, but at what cost? He's lost his freedom, his peace of mind, and his connection to humanity. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes getting what you want can come at a terrible price.
Makes you think, you know? Would you rather die unaware or live with the burden of knowing that your survival has brought death to others? It's a question with no easy answers. That's what makes Life Debt such a powerful story. It stays with you long after you've finished reading it, forcing you to confront your own fears and anxieties about life and death.
You know, for a story about death, Life Debt really makes you appreciate life. It reminds us that every moment is precious, every connection is valuable, because we never know when it will all be taken away.
So true. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our discussion on Life Debt. But before we go, I want to leave you with this. As you go about your day, pay attention to the shadows. You never know what secrets they might be hiding.
Ooh, that's a good one. And don't forget to hit that like button and follow for more chilling tales of terror. Until next time, stay spooky.